Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Paul, for this powerful word. Really appreciate it. Thank you all for coming to listen to us tonight. We are very grateful. Christians are called to be the salt of the earth, and we are called to be the light of the world, right? And at the heart of that calling is the vocation to be peacemakers. Yet what if I told you that for more than a century, Christian theology has been one of the greatest obstacles to peace in the Holy Land? That's a disturbing claim, but sadly, it's the reality. The ongoing dispossession and subjugation of the Palestinian people have not been sustained by military power alone. It has been sustained by Christian theology and biblical interpretations that have convinced millions of Christians that the establishment and the continuous expansion of the modern state of Israel is the fulfillment of God's promises. These interpretations are by no means confined to fundamentalism, by the way. Many just link Christian Zionism to dispensationalism and fundamentalism, but it's not confined to these theological traditions alone. They appear in a broad theological spectrum, from the dispensational all the way to progressive and liberal theologies, including the continuously evolving post-Holocaust and post-supersessionalist theologies, as well as many of the dominant approaches to Christian-Jewish dialogue. While these traditions differ significantly from one another, they nevertheless share a common assumption that the Old Testament promises concerning the Israelite return to the Promised Land find their fulfillment in the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. And today I want to focus on this particular assumption, not only because it is theologically scandalous and a distortion to the gospel, but also because it has legitimized Palestinian dispossession, and it has perpetuated oppression and undermined any prospect for a just peace in Palestine. And the problem with this theology is twofold. One, it is a profound distortion of our faith and of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And second, it poses an existential threat to the people of Palestine. Imagine that for a second. Christian theology imposes an existential threat to a group of people. A few weeks ago, I came across an article in the Jerusalem Post, an Israeli newspaper, that perfectly illustrates this. The article celebrated the arrival of a group of Jews from northeastern India to Israel. Their migration, what Zionism calls aliyah, was described as the fulfillment of biblical prophecy by this author. He's a Jewish author. And to argue his case, the author cites Isaiah 43:5. I will bring your descendants from the east and gather you from the west. And he argues that the east in that verse in Isaiah refers to India. Basically, for this author, the aliyah of this Indian community was not only a homecoming, it was God's promise fulfilled. It was evidence that God was gathering his people from the ends of the earth. And as I read this article, I found myself asking a simple question. Why does a Jew from India have the right to move to Palestine, while I, personally, a Palestinian from Bethlehem, do not have such a right? And that's not a rhetorical question for me. It's a real one. I personally grew up in Palestine. I lived there most of my life. Yet due to Israel's apartheid policy, my family was forced to leave in 2017. And we have not been able to return since. And this is not a new or a unique story. It has been happening since 1948. My story actually continues the story of my grandfather Najib, who in 1948 was expelled from his village in Galilee when the Zionists invaded his town. And he could not go back. Not even for a visit. For 20 years, he could not go back. And finally, he was able to visit, and he took my mom with him, who was 8 years old then. But when he knocked on the door of the house he grew up in, only he found there a Jewish family living in his house. They were now the owners of the house. The story of the Palestinian people is one of dispossession, of continued Nakba. That's the word we use for what happened in 1948. Of continued ethnic cleansing. This is our story. Meanwhile, someone who has never set foot in Palestine, who may never even have visited, suddenly has the right to immigrate there simply because they are Jewish. What an absurdity. As I wrote in a recent article, Aliyah, the so-called right to return, is one of the most dangerous pillars of Zionism. Aliyah simply means Palestinian dispossession. Now you might ask, okay, wait a minute, we are Christians here. What is wrong with immigration? Shouldn't we as Christians welcome the stranger? Well, here it is vital to make a clear distinction, and I need to use this terminology, we need to make a clear distinction between ordinary immigration and settler colonial migration. Ordinary immigrants move from one country to another to live among and integrate into the local population. In contrast, settler colonial migrations seek to replace the indigenous population. As God's people, of course, we are commanded to welcome the stranger. Deuteronomy 10:19 declares very clearly, you shall love the sojourner, the immigrant. And frankly, as Palestinians, we are known for our hospitality. If you have visited Palestine, you know exactly what I mean. And if you have not visited yet, let me offer a shameless plug here that we are hosting a special Christ at the Checkpoint conference. Maybe we can have the slide. During Christmas this year. So we invite you to come and celebrate with us Christ at the Checkpoint in Bethlehem, where it all started. And you have the QR code here, and registration is open. And if you cannot make it to Bethlehem, I have big news, a big announcement, that we are bringing Christ at the Checkpoint here to Belfast, and we've just opened the registration for it. We're calling it Church at the Crossroads. That's our international conference. And if you are interested, also the QR code would take you directly into the registration page. Close of parenthesis. Speaking of Palestinian hospitality now, it's important to note, going back to history a little bit, that before Palestinians fully understood the goals and motivations of the Zionist movement, many Palestinians welcomed Jewish immigrants. They received them as newcomers, as neighbors. The tragedy is what initially appeared to be immigration was in reality part of a settler colonial project that ultimately sought to displace the people of Palestine. The aim of Zionism from its very inception was never simply to facilitate Jewish immigration so that Jews could live alongside the local Palestinian population. Its goal was to establish a Jewish state, what the founder of Zionism called der Judenstaat in German, the Jewish state, in a land already inhabited by another people, the Palestinians. This meant the forced displacement of the Palestinians to replace them with Jewish immigrants. And replacement, in fact, is the very logic of settler colonialism. That's actually how we translate it into Arabic. We use the word replacement. It's a replacement colonialism. And that is why settler colonialism has so often been intertwined with ethnic cleansing and genocide. How could a population replace another, right? You need to do all of this, right? The indigenous population must either be removed, subordinated, or eliminated for the success of any settler colonial project. As one banner displayed outside an Israeli prison said, I will pursue, so this is a banner outside of an Israeli prison. It said, I will pursue my enemies until I annihilate them. Israel has pursued the full range of settler colonial practices against the Palestinians. Population transfer, apartheid and subjugation, and now genocide. At its core, this is the outworking of a settler colonial project. which is a sin against God and against humanity. And it is high time that as Christians we say this loud and clear. However, when it comes to Jews and Palestine, many speak of a special bond with our land, right? Our podcast, BIPJ's podcast, Across the Divide, has been running a special series on Jews and Judaism. And if you don't follow our podcast, we will leave you another QR code here. My colleague Daniel Bannura has been interviewing important Jewish rabbis, academics, and theologians. And one thing I noticed across all of these interviews that we've been doing for many months is that all of the interviewees, and some of whom are anti-Zionist, they deeply acknowledge, they acknowledge a deep Jewish connection to the land of Palestine. And this is hardly surprising. The Hebrew Bible breathes the air of Palestine on almost every page. The promised land, the land of milk and honey. It's woven into the fabric of the text from beginning to end. And in Rabbinic Judaism, the land is constantly present. A friend of mine, Kim Phillips, who's a manuscript expert at Cambridge, recently published a short article about his work on a fascinating 12th century Hebrew codex written in Iran on gold sleeves, like on golden sleeves, made actually of gold. And this is just one small piece of evidence among many that helps us appreciate how vibrant Jewish communities in the Middle East were before the Zionist colonization of Palestine. And here is the detail that struck me about that codex, that small booklet made out of gold, that it contains a single parasha, a single Torah portion, one of the 54 weekly readings recited through the year in Rabbinic Judaism. And the portion chosen to be written in gold was from Numbers 13 to 15, which opens with God's promise of the land. So every time this little golden codex is read, we don't know what was the purpose of it, why they chose this, but every time this little codex is read, Palestine would inevitably be woven into the worshipper's imagination. And the same is true of many other weekly parashot where the theme of the land features prominently. So speaking about Rabbinic Judaism. So the question is that spiritual connection with Palestine itself immoral? Does it necessarily lead to Palestinian dispossession? The answer is no, not at all. Christians, Muslims, Samaritans, Druze, Baha'is, and others all have deep connections to Palestine. And going back to that codex, right, although the Promised Land was always part of the Jewish imagination and prayers, we do not hear Jews invading Palestine in the 12th century to take back their land, right? There was pilgrimage to Palestine, perhaps immigration, but not settler colonialism. In fact, most religious Jews were opposed to Zionism right up until 1967, when we begin to see the emergence of a religious nationalist Zionist movement, some members of which now sit in the Israeli government, like Ben Gvir and Smotrich. We have a saying in Arabic, كل واحد على دينه الله يعينه. Each one according to their religion, may God help them. And I think this solves the problem of interfaith dialogue. Every person is entitled to their own religious convictions and their spiritual attachment. If Jews feel a deep connection to the land of Palestine, that's completely legitimate, just as it is for Christians, Samaritans, Muslims, Druze, Baha'is, and so on. But a spiritual connection is not a colonial license. Feeling connected to a land because of my religion is not the same as having the right to colonize it. Loving a land is not the same as having the right to expel its people. The moment religious sentiment is translated into a settler colonial program of dispossession, the moment it's used to justify aliyah, settlements, apartheid, genocide, it has crossed a line that no theology, no religion should ever sanctify. And the burden of the work here, when it comes to Judaism, falls on our Jewish allies and friends. The non-Zionist Jewish community, the rabbis, the theologians, the activists who reject the Zionist settler colonial project. And there are many of them, thankfully. What is needed is a liberative theology, Jewish theology of the land, one that holds the spiritual connection with the land while refusing the supremacy and settler colonialism hardwired into Zionism. The problem is not with Judaism, the problem is with Zionism. And that is not, obviously, my work as a Christian theologian to do, but I'm grateful for every Jewish voice that is doing it. Disentangling and decoupling Zionism from Judaism. However, when it comes to how Christians understand the biblical promises of return, that is our responsibility, especially those of us who are theologians and biblical specialists. And I would add it is our responsibility as Palestinian Christians, because the Bible is part and parcel not only of our spiritual heritage, but our culture and history. It is not only our sacred text, it is also in a profound sense our indigenous text, as Mr. Rahib has argued. Christian Zionism makes a sweeping and deeply problematic claim that the Old Testament prophecies of Israel's restoration are fulfilled in 1948 in the establishment of the modern state of Israel. And this claim rests, among many other texts, on Deuteronomy 30, verses 1 to 10, God's promise to gather Israel back to the land after exile. And this promise of return is echoed throughout the prophets, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Isaiah, among others. And it is astonishing how many Christians hold this view. According to Pew Research, 70% of white evangelicals hold Zionist theological beliefs, 70%. Recently, I was invited, I live now in Cochabamba, Bolivia, and I was invited to preach at our Lutheran church there. The appointed reading was one of these texts that refer to the promise of return, of Israel's restoration. The text was from Ezekiel 34. And it spoke of God as the shepherd who would search for his sheep, referring to Israel, and gather them into the promised land. Now, our church follows a beautiful lectionary, and this reading from Ezekiel was beautifully paired with John 10, where Jesus identifies himself as the good shepherd who gathers the sheep. And the text uses a language similar to the language of Isaiah. Yet, when I asked the congregation at the beginning of my sermon, when do you think Ezekiel's prophecy was fulfilled? And I told my wife that I will ask this question, and she told me, don't worry, no one will know, you're in Cochabamba in a Lutheran church. But I did ask, and then immediately in our local congregation, a Lutheran congregation in Cochabamba, Bolivia, someone shouted 1949, the other 1948. Almost the entire church connected the prophecy with the modern state of Israel. And this was again a liturgical Lutheran church in Cochabamba, Bolivia, not a church in Austin, Texas, right? So this indicates how prevalent this theology is in Christian churches around the world. It has been exported everywhere. It's a standard teaching in so many churches. However, for those of us who love the Bible, and we're in a Presbyterian church, the question must be pressed. If these Old Testament prophecies of restoration are not fulfilled in the Zionist movement and Theodor Herzl and the establishment of Israel in 1948, then how and where are they fulfilled? Right? Palestinian Christian theologians have been giving a consistent answer. All the promises of God find their yes in Jesus. Right? This is what Paul says in 2 Corinthians. But here I would like to add something specific to that answer, something actually that my own PhD research in scriptures has brought into focus. That the prophecy of Israel's restoration, set in motion through the coming of Jesus, began to take concrete historical shape on the day of Pentecost. That the prophecy of Israel's restoration was set in motion through the coming of Jesus, began to take concrete historical shape on the day of Pentecost. Let me dig into this a little bit. Luke, the author of the third gospel and of Acts, draws extensively on the language and themes of Deuteronomy 30, the first mention of this prophecy of return, particularly as found in its ancient Greek translation, the Septuagint. And he does so to portray, I argue, Pentecost as the climactic fulfillment of the Old Testament promise of Israel's restoration. The prophecy in Deuteronomy speaks of the ingathering of the dispersed Israelites from one end of heaven, in the Greek translation, one end of Uranos, to the other end of Uranos, from heaven to heaven. It speaks about their numeric multiplication in the land. And crucially, the renewal of the covenant, returning to God, forgiveness of sins, joy, and the cleansing of the heart, language that Luke picks up on. Actually, Luke picks up on every one of these themes in his narrative. He describes how dispersed Jews and Israelites, Judaioi, Israelitai, come from every nation under Uranos, under heaven, and they gather together in Jerusalem, at the heart of the promised land. There they experience the renewal of their covenant with God. And Pentecost in the first century was already associated with covenant renewal. They return to God, they receive forgiveness of sins, they experience divine joy in Acts 2:46, and the community begins to multiply. And Luke picks up on all of these Greek multiplication verbs from Deuteronomy, that they multiply. And he's very big on how the expansion of the church, and they increased. And even the promise in Deuteronomy 37 that those who persecute the returnees from exile will face judgment finds its dramatic fulfillment in Acts 12, when Herod, who laid violent hands on the early church, is struck down by an angel and dies. But there is another central element in the prophecy, one that connects restoration, the restoration of the Jews, to justice. Deuteronomy 36, the heart of this prophecy, says the following: the Lord your God will cleanse your heart. The Hebrew has it, circumcised your heart, and the hearts of your descendants, to love, in order that you love the Lord with all your heart, soul, so that you may live. This is a remarkable moment in Deuteronomy, right? And we must not rush past it. The whole thrust of Deuteronomic theology is that Israel must work very hard to obey and love God. In Israel and in other places in Deuteronomy, the responsibility is placed on the Israelites themselves to cleanse or circumcise their heart. For example, in Deuteronomy 10, the text says, "You therefore circumcise the foreskin of your heart and be no longer stubborn." But in Deuteronomy 30, that prophecy, it's towards the end of the book of Deuteronomy, in a beautiful section, it is God who will cleanse and circumcise the heart. God himself will make it possible for the returnees to love God. But okay, what is this big deal out? Okay, love God, we understand this shift, but what does it what's the connection with justice? What does it, why this emphasis in Deuteronomy? Actually, Deuteronomy has, from the beginning to end, love God as the central commandment that sums up the whole law, right? And at the end, the prophecy of return, God says, "I will circumcise your heart so that you can now love God." That's it. That's the central command. This is the whole summation of the law. In Deuteronomy, loving God, one of the most difficult commands to really unpack, right, on a quick reading, because for us, we associate loving God with piety, just with individualistic piety. But in Deuteronomy, loving God is not a private spiritual sentiment. It's the most central command in the book that sums up the entire Mosaic law. And in Deuteronomy, loving God means imitating God. Imitatio Dei. Imitating God in what? In standing with the oppressed and with the marginalized. And the model that Deuteronomy uses is the model of the Exodus. As God delivered the oppressed Israelites from Egypt, so Israel is called to do for the vulnerable within their own community. And we see this very, very clearly in Deuteronomy 10, verses 12 to 19. So simply put, to love God is to work for justice. So God is promising the returnees from exile that he will cleanse their hearts so that they are now empowered to embody his justice. That's how God is loved. And the insight of Deuteronomy is this: God's people cannot do it alone. God's people are failing to embody God's justice. They fail, and as a result, they are sent to exile. This is the prophecy. But God promises that a day will come when He will gather them back. This time He Himself will transform their hearts so that they can truly love Him and embody His justice. Some think that this promise was fulfilled in the return of Ezra and Nehemiah, right? They were exiled and then they came back. Done, right? Yet the books of Ezra and Nehemiah tell a very different story. Social injustice persists in the community. Foreigners are excluded, and the narrative ends not with transformed hearts, but with Nehemiah rebuking, cursing, and even striking members of the community, if you remember, right? And then, before pleading with God, remember me with favor, and the book ends. We do not see the circumcision of the heart promised in Deuteronomy and the prophets, nor do we see, as Ezekiel prophesied about Israel's restoration, God's Spirit poured upon the people to give them a new heart. Indeed, actually, many Jews in the first century still understood themselves to be living in a state of exile. In the first century, Jews believed that they were living in a state of exile even while dwelling in the land. In summary, I argue that there is no better place in the entire scripture where we see the promise of Israel's restoration fulfilled than in the Pentecost narrative. The community of Israelites gathered from around the world not only experiences forgiveness of sins and the joy that comes with it, but their hearts are now transformed by the Holy Spirit. They are able to embody God's justice. We see this in two extraordinary passages immediately following the outpouring of the Spirit in Pentecost, in Acts 2 and in Acts 4. There, Luke deliberately echoes the language of loving God, of the Shema. In Acts 4:32, Luke writes, the whole group of believers were one heart and soul. Kardia kai psuche. He takes it from the Shema of the Greek Old Testament. The combination of heart and soul is not found in any other extra-biblical literature, right, in Greco-Roman literature. It is distinctly Deuteronomic, recalling the exhortation to love God with all of one's heart, all of one's soul. Luke is not merely describing here harmony within the community. He is portraying the fulfillment of the Deuteronomic vision. The restored people of God, loving God by centering the poor, living in solidarity and pursuing socio-economic justice and equality. They are loving God, heart and soul in community. They're fleshing it out. This is Israel's restoration, dear sisters and brothers, not an ethno-religious state built on apartheid and genocide, not the expulsion of an indigenous people dressed up in the language of prophecy, but a spirit-filled community gathered from every nation with hearts cleansed and circumcised by God Himself, living out the justice of God in a broken and messed up world. In summary, the Zionist so-called right of return functions as a tool of dispossession against the people of Palestine. It cannot and must not be baptized by Christian theology. Any theology that provides cover for the ethnic cleansing of Palestine is not a truthful word about God. It's a heresy that conscripts Scripture into the service of settler colonialism, and in doing so betrays the very spirit of the prophecies it claims to fulfill. God's promises of Israel's restoration are not fulfilled through settler colonial migration to a land from which indigenous people are expelled. They are fulfilled in Jesus. That's ABC Christianity. God's promises are fulfilled in Jesus. Indeed, those promises, again, began to be fulfilled concretely and unmistakably on the day of Pentecost, when God's Spirit was poured out, hearts were cleansed, and Jews from every nation were gathered, not to expel others from their towns and villages, but to become a new people empowered to love God by embodying His justice. This is Israel's restoration. Not the conquest of a land, but the creation of a people, Jews and Gentiles, whose hearts have been transformed. Not the exclusion of others, but the blessing of the nations. Not a project of domination, but a spirit-filled community embodying God's justice in the world. Thank you.